Namaste and kia ora, everybody. We like each other, is the short answer. We got on, and we actually have a similar approach to how you run government and how you set targets and how you drive towards delivery and outcomes. And you'll find that we've got a very, very warm relationship.
With the Prime Minister taking centre stage in India and the Foreign Minister holding court in America.
We're very pleased with our meeting with Secretary of State Marco Rubio. We came here to listen to the new administration and to be clear about what is important to New Zealand. Today we enjoyed a substantive and productive discussion with the Secretary across a broad range of issues. There's a lot happening in the Indo-Pacific and indeed our world. It's a seriously valuable time to be here in Washington, D.C.
New Zealand had a big week on the world stage.
New Zealand Prime Minister Christopher Luxon is in India on a 5-day visit. This is the first visit by a New Zealand Prime Minister to India in 9 years.
Further cementing their warm and friendly ties, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi held talks with his New Zealand counterpart Christopher Luxon in New Delhi.
Good to see you again, my friend. Are you well?
Yeah, very well. Yes, lots happening on the world stage with New Zealand at the moment. Foreign Minister Winston Peters has had his first meetings in Washington, D.C.
Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters says his time in Washington, D.C. has been seriously valuable.
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and on the detail today, the breakdown of what the big political power meetings mean for New Zealand and what really goes on behind closed doors. We talked to Newsroom political editor Laura Walters about Prime Minister Christopher Luxon's trip to India, where trade deals were negotiated, cricket was played, and pointed remarks were made.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi has raised a few eyebrows during a joint press conference with Prime Minister Christopher Luxon after he called out anti-India activities from what he claimed were some illegal elements in New Zealand.
How did Luxon address that, and was it awkward on the ground over there?
It was an awkward moment, wasn't it?
While RNZ political editor Lillian Hanley is in Washington, D.C, where Foreign Minister Winston Peters met with Secretary of State Marco Rubio to strengthen our ties with the US.
We're in a changing world, and the implications of these decisions are going to be long-lasting. I think that he does have the experience, though, and he is well-equipped, and he's come in here and he's worn his foreign minister's hat very well.
But let's start with Laura in India.
These trips are a whirlwind, and our Prime Minister is a self-described Energizer bunny. So the programs are jam-packed. The security is incredibly tight here in India. It was really tight in Delhi. But between the tight security and the Prime Minister's desire sometimes to keep some of his colourful content exclusively for social media, there isn't the same kind of access that we have seen on some previous trips and with other Prime Ministers.
Well, namaste and kia ora, everybody. Can I just thank up front Prime Minister Modi for the very warm and generous welcome that we've had, myself and also our delegation.
India is obviously a massive market for New Zealand. It holds a lot of potential, a lot of opportunity. I mean, if you just think about it in sheer size, it's the world's most populous country at the moment. It's the 5th largest economy and on track to soon become the 3rd largest economy. So it's a very big market, and it's quite untapped for us. Initially, from a pure market size and economic sense, it's a huge opportunity for New Zealand that really hasn't been progressed or tapped into to the extent that Christopher Luxon thinks it could be. So India is very important in our region. It's a massive growing superpower, and from this government's perspective, they say we've kind of undercooked the relationship so far, and they really need to step it up.
Do you feel like they've just got the cooking right now as a result of this trip?
The feedback from people on this trip has been incredibly positive. I think people were going into it with a mix of almost high hopes but low expectations, if that makes sense.
So after 5 days of schmoozing and deals on the ground,
people are impressed. They're happy. They can see that it is right to be leaning into this relationship with India. So the feedback here is that the government has got it about right. Of course, when you're away on these trips, you kind of get swept up in the moment. So it will be interesting to see what Kiwis think when the Prime Minister gets back home.
How do you think he's performed? Because he's just come off some bad poll results back here.
The coalition government would be gone if an election were held now, based on the shock result in the first One News Varian poll of the year.
How do you think he's performed on that world stage?
Luxon's in his element when he does this, travelling, especially with a business delegation. He loves that. He loves talking to the business community. He feels comfortable there. Of course, he has this corporate background and he's very comfortable speaking to the business community, both the New Zealand delegation, but also the businesses that he's meeting in India. He's also good at building leader-to-leader relationships. He's very engaged when he meets world leaders. He'll lean in for that hug. He'll shake their hands. You see him patting people on the back. And sometimes you see comments about it, how tactile Luxon is. But that does play well with a lot of leaders, especially in Asia. And we've seen that again on previous trips, but again with his meeting with Modi.
It's this warm relationship that's seen India and New Zealand resume negotiations for a free trade agreement after a decade-long pause.
Some more good news for New Zealand Inc. as it's been announced overnight as part of the PM's trade trip to India this week. They've officially launched free trade negotiations.
Talk us through this. What are the key sectors sort of targeted? When can we expect action to happen?
Obviously, a lot of people are talking about dairy as a key sector to watch in terms of a free trade agreement with India. We know that it has been a sticking point in the past. I have spoken to Simon Tucker from Fonterra, who is in charge of their global affairs, essentially, and he seemed incredibly confident that this government would manage to get a free trade agreement that included dairy in some form. Now, of course, what form that takes is what the negotiators are going to need to work through over this process. But beyond dairy, of course, there are other primary exports that we know really well. Red meat, for example, lamb, I think at the moment is being tariffed about 30% or 33% when it comes into India. We've seen Australia has got the tariffs wiped off lamb. They have it on other red meat still, but wiped off lamb. So that's another sector that New Zealand will be looking to get a win for. Then we've got things like apples and kiwi fruit as well. But beyond that, so those, if you think about those things as big wins potentially for New Zealand out of a free trade agreement, but there are also things that New Zealand can offer India in that kind of value add or higher value space. There's been a lot of discussion about New Zealand's agri-tech exports. So agriculture is a massive sector for India as well. And New Zealand has good agri-tech that can help lift the efficiency and the productivity and the scalability for Indian agriculture and farmers. And then we've got other things as well, like biosecurity and food security that New Zealand could really, sell as a good value proposition for India.
Other potential areas include space and film.
Now, in terms of the timing, how soon it's going to happen, well, look, your guess is as good as mine at this stage. Of course, the Prime Minister set that end-of-term deadline for himself, which he will not back down from. So I think he's very, very keen to make good on that commitment of delivering a free trade deal by the end of the term. Of course, whether that happens is another question. But he's also revealed that he's, internally or privately given himself the expectation that he might get it done by the end of the year. That's not a hard deadline, but that's an expectation he's setting for himself and his team. And on the Modi's side as well, he's told his team to make this a priority.
Other good news to emerge during the visit, the investigation of a direct flight between the two countries by 2028. But among the handshakes, smiles, hugs and deals, there was a wee bit of turbulence.
We have shared our concerns about anti-India activities by some illegal elements in New Zealand, Modi said. He went on, we are confident that we will continue to receive the support of the New Zealand government in taking action.
It was an awkward moment, wasn't it? There were all these platitudes and positive expressions and talk of this positive relationship, and then all of a sudden Modi threw this in what it felt like to the audience out of left field. Talking about anti-India separatist activities in New Zealand. He said that he was confident he would have the support of the New Zealand government and actions that he decided to take against them, and of course all of the New Zealand media in the room, their ears all pricked up and thought, what's going on here? Of course, that wouldn't have been a surprise to Luxon. When they make these statements, when they release these joint texts, they are agreed by both sides ahead of time. So Luxon would have known that was coming. But it did make for an awkward conversation there. There's, like we've been saying, there's a lot of goodwill between both sides, but this is a real sticking point. It's going to be a sticking point potentially for the relationship if they can't manage to have a free and frank but also respectful conversation between the two parties, but also for the populations both in New Zealand, those Kiwi Indians as well as people back in India. They will be watching this really, really closely.
We respect India's sovereign territory and sovereignty, but clearly we also have free speech in New Zealand.
Now, Christopher Luxon's response to Modi's comments, I think he struck the right balance and he stayed really firm. He was tested on his principles there and on New Zealand's principles there, and he did not waver from his position.
I should point out it wasn't all business and politics in India.
It's been cricket in every single conversation. You can see how important those sporting ties are between New Zealand and India.
And I do want to say to the Prime Minister, I really have appreciated him not raising the recent loss of New Zealand to India. And I haven't mentioned any of the Test series wins that we had on our recent trip to India either. So let's just keep it that way and we'll avoid a major diplomatic incident.
He did play some cricket. How were his cricket skills rated over there?
He did definitely hit a few balls, I can tell you that. He did some bowling, he did some batting, he even ran a few after a bit of encouragement to do so. And so I think that people really appreciated that. You could see he was in his element there. He loved it so much. I think he said to the kids at the start of the game that, it's probably the highlight of his trip so far, and I wouldn't be surprised if he said that, at the conclusion of the trip as well. But it was good. It was good to see him getting stuck in there. Of course, these things can be a bit cringy. They are photo opportunities. They do look good on the social media, but also him setting that up, or his staff setting that up with some pretty big cricketing legends, made for an amazing experience for those kids, and he had a good go at it. So you've got to hand it to him there.
Is he known over there? Was it a big deal, him being in India? Did he get much media coverage?
There was a lot of media coverage in the way that there's always a lot of Indian media coverage or local media coverage of a visiting head of government. It would be hard to say whether the average local would have any idea who Christopher Luxon was. I actually bumped into someone at the hotel, and when I told him we were here travelling with the Prime Minister, he said, "Oh, she's here." So he hadn't quite clocked that we no longer had Jacinda Ardern as our Prime Minister. So that probably gives a good gauge of what the average Indian knows about New Zealand and Christopher Luxon. But in saying that, there were these massive posters that lined probably about 10 kilometres between the airport that we flew into in Delhi and Christopher Luxon's hotel, and every 100 metres for that 10 Ks or so, there was a massive poster with Christopher Luxon's head on it welcoming him to India. So anyone who didn't know about Christopher Luxon before and lived in that area certainly would now.
Some 12,000 k's away in Washington, D.C, Winston Peters was meeting Marco Rubio to put New Zealand's position on the table with the new administration. Lillian Hanley was there.
It's an opportunity for Winston Peters as Foreign Minister to get a better sense of just where their policy direction is going and how that's going to impact on New Zealand. I will caveat that with Winston Peters saying that he's been preparing for this for a long time, well before the US election even, given Trump's policies were well signalled. So in some respects, Winston Peters does know what the new administration is planning to do, but what they wanted to be able to do with this trip is just get face-to-face, get on the ground, get a better indication, better context, all of that kind of information that you can just get firsthand in order to really just understand exactly how that will impact New Zealand.
Do you know what topics were actually discussed in that meeting with Marco Rubio?
These things are always a little bit vague unless they kind of come out with the big, broad brushstrokes. So we know that obviously trade was discussed, defence and security, the US role in the Pacific. So those sorts of broad ideas and issues. But in terms of more specific details, that's kind of where Winston Peters was not willing to report on immediately afterward. He wanted to be able to take that information that he's gathered and share it with his cabinet colleagues first, he said.
What about tariffs? Did the Foreign Minister broach this with the Secretary of State?
What Winston Peters did was emphasise that New Zealand has a fairly consistent position on trade. He reminded the Secretary that New Zealand has long wanted a free trade agreement with the US and that we have had a fairly balanced and fair relationship when it comes to trade for a long time now. And he indicated that Secretary Rubio heard that. So that was kind of Mr. Peters, that's what he said in terms of putting New Zealand's position on the table. It's kind of like you can't really come into this and say, hey, look, don't put tariffs on us. You know, you saw what happened with Australia in terms of requesting an exemption on those tariffs, and that didn't work out for them.
Good evening. Allies for almost a century, but tonight a relationship damaged as America slapped huge tariffs on imported Australian steel and aluminium.
And so I suppose what Mr. Peters did was just go into this and say, look, this is where we stand and better understand kind of what they intend to do. Again, we didn't get that detail out of him, but I expect we will hear it at some point down the track. And of course, more detail will come when the decisions are actually made by the Trump administration.
She says Peters raised the issue of US aid funding for the Pacific region, but no decision will be made until next month.
He also flagged that New Zealand has a long-standing relationship with China and that we value our trade relationship with China. But I think there was also kind of an indication there too that with that increasing presence in the Indo-Pacific, that China's increasing presence, that again, New Zealand would like the US to play a greater role there in kind of keeping that balance. Some other issues that came up, which again, light on detail, but we did ask whether New Zealand had a role to play in the Ukraine-Russia ceasefire negotiations, and he did say that, of course, the Russia-Ukraine ceasefire did come up, but New Zealand's role didn't come up, nor did it come up, obviously, with that conversation between President Putin and President Trump. So in that sense, we aren't any the wiser as to just what role New Zealand could or would play in something like that. But Mr. Peters has pointed out that obviously those conversations and the negotiations around that ceasefire are very early days, so we're sort of yet to see any kind of indication that New Zealand will even have a role to play.
Right before the meeting, President Trump was nearby calling Russian President Vladimir Putin.
In what the White House has described as a frank phone call between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, the Russian president has agreed to a limited temporary halt on attacks on energy and infrastructure targets, but rejecting the much sought-after immediate and full 30-day ceasefire.
At the point of us, myself and TVNZ reporter Logan Church were waiting for Mr. Peters and Mr. Rubio to come and do their grip and grin before their meeting. We saw that news about the phone call between President Trump and President Putin. So yes, it was all very, very timely. So potentially Mr. Peters in that meeting would have heard firsthand some of what was discussed. Yeah.
How long was the meeting? And I understand it may have gone over time. And is that like a good sign, I guess?
It was a short meeting in the sense that Mr. Peters said, you can only go into so much in that regard. But yes, it did run long. So in terms of how long they had allocated for it, it did run over. And that's always a positive thing. Secretary Rubio is probably one of the busiest people in the Trump administration. So it's actually pretty phenomenal that Mr. Peters got a meeting with him at all.
And can it be classed as successful? Like, has it gone down well?
So Mr. Peters says he, and this is a quote, seriously pleased with the outcome. He when he came out, and not only with the meeting with Secretary Rubio, because he had a number of other meetings on this trip as well, including with the National Security Advisor. And after those meetings, I would have looked at him and thought he looked pretty chuffed. And I think that Winston Peters has done a lot of prep for this trip, and he's done his due diligence, he's done his research, and he's been able to just gather, I think, the information required to make better decisions or better analysis in terms of how to respond to what is seemingly a huge departure in US foreign and trade policy. So yes, I think that in some respects it would definitely be classed as a success.
Now, Winston was obviously last there under the Biden administration. How do the meetings and the relationship between the countries differ, do you think?
From what we can see from the outside, is this new administration is significantly different in some respects to the previous. Mr. Peters would say that actually, in the scheme of things, it's not a huge change or a huge departure in terms of his role, right? Because what he's doing is coming and representing New Zealand and engaging with the administration, whoever it is. What they've done is come and met them. It's essentially a sort of new chapter, right? So you just have to start fresh because you're dealing with a whole bunch of new characters, I suppose. But it's still the same sort of game. It's still the same set up, the same roles, all those sorts of things. But yes, this is a different chapter.
And this is probably a brutal question, Lillian, but does anyone really care that we're there? Was there much media coverage over there of this meeting and our relationship, with the US government?
I don't think so, Amanda. I had touch base with a few, experts, people in think tanks and political scientists based here and that sort of thing. And I don't think that there's been a huge following in terms of what's been going on between the New Zealand Foreign Minister and the Secretary of State. However, I do think it's of much interest to people back home.
It was so low-key, Winston Peters travelled by public transport for the meeting.
The Minister for Rail took a train from New York to Washington. There is photographic evidence, yes.
How unusual is that? Especially for a foreign minister in the States to travel by train to an important meeting like that.
I mean, potentially it might have been the most effective or efficient way to get there. Yeah, I think potentially quite unusual. Yeah, the travel is always very careful, controlled, secure. But yes, I think in this instance, they saw an opportunity from the Minister for Rail.
For journalists, getting to the meeting on site was a bit more intense and complicated.
I had to have my passport and I had to have my press badge from New Zealand, and then that I was able to secure a press pass from them. And then the way that we had to go into the building, we had to be escorted, a whole range of us, so us New Zealand media, but also American media, who I guess do this all the time, but they escorted us through the building. We had to leave anything with a sort of Bluetooth capacity, so in a room before we went into the space where we were going to capture a photograph of the minister meeting Secretary Rubio. We had to leave all our phones, our laptops, even if you had a Apple Watch, things like that, in a separate room. And then you go in just with your recording devices and an official kind of camera. So very secure, very careful, very a lot of process behind it. But yeah, it's sort of slightly bizarre when you're coming from New Zealand.
And for all that security, they didn't actually get much access compared to a normal Prime Minister's visit.
We haven't been invited into the meetings themselves. We haven't been able to witness some of those opening remarks. We're not, normally you're not invited for the entirety of the meeting, but you do get those opening remarks at the top, just where there's some general statements between each person. But in these meetings, usually they've all happened behind closed doors, and the only kind of access that we got with Secretary Rubio was in the grip and grin before their meeting, and they didn't actually say anything at all.
But overall, how did our Foreign Minister perform on the big stage?
He's done very well as Foreign Minister. He does have the experience, and he is well equipped, and he's come in here and he's worn his Foreign Minister's hat very well.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Lillian Hanley and Laura Walters. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Phil Benj. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.